Hello and welcome to day 4 of Through the Bible. Today we're going to be taking a look at Genesis chapter 13 through 16. So we see that Abraham has now left Egypt where he went because of the famine, and he is headed toward the southern region of Judah. Abram at that point, and Sarai, Lot, and everything they owned went with them. The Bible tells us that Abraham was very rich with livestock, silver, and gold. And I think this is important because of the vision that was placed on his life, the prophetic vision that God had given him was going to require provision. So he was giving to that in advance. We can call that provisioning the promise. He went by stages to Bethel and Ai. And we see that in between Bethel and Ai, he built an altar and called on the name of the Lord. Again, referencing back to Genesis chapter 4 when men began to call on the name of the Lord. The land was unsuitable for both Abraham and Lot, or Abram and Lot. And so he gave Lot the choice of what land he wanted to take. We see that Lot chooses the land that looks beautiful and prosperous, but he ignored the sin that was there. So he was picking what looked good to the eyes, but not necessarily to the spirit. And you can pick up the spiritual connotations there. It says that he set up a tent, Lot that is, near Sodom, where there was great sinning against the Lord. So we know that it was a region that was looked very good. It probably had a lot of opportunities, a lot of possibilities, a lot of business things, a lot of entertainment things, but yet it was a place that God was not pleased with. Abram lived in Canaan, which was God's intent all along. So even though Abram had given Lot the choice, everything ended up the way God wanted it to. Then we jump into Genesis 14. The Assyrian Kings, there were four nations, that were surrounded by these Syrian kings, or allied with these Syrian kings. And they went to war with 5 kings that were allied with Sodom and Gomorrah. And the reason they did that was because these nations had rebelled. They had apparently been vassal kingdoms to the Assyrian kingdom, and as a result, they rebelled, and when they did, then the Assyrians began to chase after them. They ended up not only taking everything in Sodom and Gomorrah and other places, but also ended up taking Lot with them and everything Lot owned. So Abram got 318 trained men out of his household. Think about that for me. He had 318 men in his household that were trained and ready for war. And he took them, he attacked by night, he took everything back. And this is where the story gets really good. So the king of Sodom comes out to meet him, and along with him comes the king of Salem. Now the king of Salem, we believe that that actually is Jerusalem, so Jerusalem, if you will. So that will eventually be called Jerusalem. But he was the king of Salem at the time. His name was Melchizedek. And this is a very central figure within the gospel. He brought bread and wine. I want you to pick that up. He brought bread and wine. And what did Jesus do at the Last Supper? Bread and wine. And then he was a priest to God Most High. And he tells Abraham, he prophesies to Abraham, you are blessed by God Most High, creator of the heaven and earth, and who gave you victory over these kings. We see in Hebrews 7:3, in talking about Melchizedek, that the author says there's no beginning or end, that he resembles the Son of God, and that he remains a priest forever, and that Jesus is a priest in the order of Melchizedek. No beginning, no ending, the bread, the wine. This could go a lot deeper, but just trying to give you some quick thoughts for today. When Sodom told Abram to keep everything except for the people, Abram responded in this way. He said, I made an oath before God that I wouldn't take anything from you, lest you say, I made Abram rich. Just give my men their share, and I'm going to take nothing. I wonder how many people would do that today. Most people today seem to think, oh, if somebody's giving me something, it must be from God. But in this case, Abram was saying, wait a minute, this is not God's plan to make me rich. It's not God's plan to do. There may be other things that are attached to accepting this thing. And so his first concern was the prophetic call that was on his life, the vision that was on his life. And that's the way we want to see things today. In chapter 15, God tells Abraham not to be afraid, and it seems kind of funny, it's kind of stuck there all of a sudden. There's no explanation for it, but God says, I am your shield, your reward will be very great. Is it possible that maybe Abram was concerned about retribution from these Assyrian kings that he had attacked? That could have been the reason God was saying, do not be afraid. Abraham questions why it's worth it that God would do all these things for him if all he has is a servant to be his heir. And God says, no, something's going to come, a son is going to come from your own body, that your heirs are going to be from you. And it says that Abraham believed the Lord, and it was credited to him as righteousness. And again, this becomes a central theme in the New Testament. We see in Romans 4:24 that it says it was written for us as well, so that we know that when we believe God, it's credited to us as righteousness, the righteousness by faith, the righteousness by the grace of God, not just by the things that we do. And then Galatians 3:6, those who have faith as Abraham. And then it goes on to say, only those who faith, and in Galatians 3:7-9, only those of faith are sons of Abraham. So you could be a Jew by circumcision and by heritage, but yet you still wouldn't be a son of Abraham if you weren't living by faith. And then it tells us that God preached the gospel before Isaac. Again, this is Galatians 3:7-9, that God preached the gospel before Isaac was even born, saying even Gentiles would be blessed through him. And aren't we glad of that today? And then James 2:23-24 says, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness, and he was called God's friend. And then he goes on to say, you see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. In other words, Abraham was taking action on what God had spoken. He was showing his faith by what he did, not just by simply saying, well, I believe it, and then moving on with it. He actually acted in a way that was consistent with what God had talked to him and what God had exposed to him. This is in no way removes the idea that we are saved by grace, not by works, lest any man should boast. But it says to us that our works will come out of our life, and that our works show that our faith is active. So, moving right along in verse 7, he says, I am the Lord, and this is where we see Yahweh mentioned. And that word Yahweh there in verse 7, it means, and everywhere you see the word Yahweh, is he brings into existence whatever exists. Often in our English Bibles, we just translate it Lord or God or something like that. But I just wanted you to point out here that he brings into existence whatever exists. So if you need something to come into existence that doesn't exist, he's the one that will do that. And then we see the Abrahamic covenant, which is where he begins to, where God actually makes a covenant with him. He tells him to prepare with a 3-year-old cow, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, a young pigeon. And this is preparation for the sacrificial law that's going to come. At this point, there's been no regulation about how sacrifices are going to be done, but we see kind of a foreshadowing, if you will, of that taking place here with Abraham. Then we see birds of prey come down because he's cut these animals in half. He's laid them out. What they would do is they would put these animals, half of these carcasses, they would walk between them. They would do kind of a figure 8 with them, both parties that were in the covenant together or making the contract together. And they would say, may this or even worse happen to me if I should break this covenant. So that was the day of the covenant is how they did that. Interestingly here, that while Abram's waiting on God, these birds of prey come down and try to take the sacrifice. And that's true for us too, that there are destiny thieves, there are covenant thieves that will try to come and to steal an opposition to the covenant that God has for our lives, those things that try to take us away from what God has planned for us. In this case, it's interesting to see that God himself is going to be the only one that passes through. We see the flame and the boiling pot, and they're going through, and this shows that in this case, that God was not just making the covenant with Abraham. It's kind of like the Noah covenant that we talked about before. God made the covenant with himself before he made it with Noah. That way it would be an eternal covenant. In this case, he made it with himself, not with Abraham at this point, or we could say in combination with Abraham. Abraham became the benefactor of the covenant, but he was not actually making the covenant. If he had made the covenant with God, had he walked through these animal sacrifice, then what could have happened is that Abraham could have messed it up. But since God made it with himself, there was no way Abraham could mess this up. It was an eternal covenant. It was one of those promised things. There are things that are prophesied in our lives, that are spoken over our lives, that God intends for our lives, that we can stop from happening. But in this case, this had to do with something much greater than Abraham. It was the entire story of Jesus and the entire story of the Bible. So God was not going to give Abraham a chance to mess this up. This was a covenant that God made with himself, and Abraham became the benefactor of it, as we have also become the benefactors of that. We can't mess up God's plans, and that's a wonderful thing for us to know. Then there was a prophecy of the descendants, but it was a mixed bag. It was saying that they're going to be blessed, but they're also going to be slaves. And then the time will come when they'll come out of that slavery. And he said that part of the reason for the wait was that the Amorites, the sin of the Amorites, was not yet full. The idea that they were on the path to God bringing judgment upon them, but they hadn't quite gotten there yet. And as soon as they got there, God had this other plan, this backup plan, which was going to be the Israelite people that were going to come in and take over the land where the Amorites currently were. But he wasn't going to let that happen until they had reached the point of no return, so to speak. I think we need to be careful about that sometimes as we look at our nation, as we look at the nations around the world, and think that, oh, God's not going to judge, God's not going to do anything like that, like he did in the Old Testament. We've already talked a little bit in previous sessions about how we see the destruction of Israel as after Christ. We see Ananias and Sapphira after Christ. We see the book of Revelation as after Christ. So God is still a God of judgment. He's also a God of grace. He was also a God of grace in the Old Testament. We're going to see that over the next several weeks as we look at the Bible this year. But keep in mind that just because he hasn't judged yet doesn't mean he's not going to judge. Sometimes he's just waiting on the fullness of the sin to reach a level where there's no return. And then chapter 16, Abraham's been waiting on the promise a long, long time. We got to be careful here because a lot of people want to judge Abraham and say, well, you should have never done the Hagar thing. That was just a huge mistake. But God had never told him at this point that the seed was going to come through Sarah. He had only told him it was coming from him at this point. So Abraham was trying to help God along, if you will. Now, with that said, that's not to justify it, because where he failed was he listened to his wife's idea instead of seeking God's advice. We see the same thing happen with Adam. He listened to his wife's advice. He took it. He failed. Why? Because he didn't seek God. Had both of these men sought God, then they may have saved a lot of pain and suffering for a lot of people after that. So while our wives and our mates are very important to us and they can give us great and often godly counsel that we'll miss on our own, we should never accept that counsel unless we've also sought from the Lord, and the Lord should confirm those things to us together. Man fails when he takes advice from anybody without first seeking from God. And then there is a prophecy given over Ishmael. He would be a wild donkey. He would be against everyone, and everyone would be against him. And this is interesting because this is the lineage of Islam, the lineage of Mohammedanism, or however you want to label that. But it's basically the line that Muhammad claims to have come out of. I believe he did come out of. And it says that he will be against everyone and everyone will be against him. And we look at the history of that group of people and we can see where that prophecy has been true. He was sent away instead of being formally adopted. Had Abraham said, "You're my heir, you're my first one," then Isaac would have never been the firstborn. But because he did not do that and instead sent him away, then that blessing went to Isaac. Abram had attempted to gain by effort what God had promised by grace, and that was the big failing. Abram attempted to gain by his efforts, by his wisdom, by his smarts, by his intelligence. Boy, I'm feeling a little guilty here. I don't know about you. But instead of relying on God's grace. And too often, we're trying to make things happen when what we need to do is rely on him. Galatians 4:24 said, "The son of the slave wife was born in a human attempt to bring about the fulfillment of God's promise." In a human attempt to bring about the fulfillment of God's promise. But the son of the freeborn wife, Sarah, was born as God's own fulfillment of the promise. So the question always becomes, are we going to try to do it through our effort, or are we going to trust God to do it through his? It will always end up better when we do it through his. Thank you. God bless you. Have a wonderful day.